My wife stood in front of her entire family, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "You have two options, apologize or leave." So I didn't apologize. I walked out to the driveway, pulled out my phone, and bought a one-way ticket to the other side of the country. Nobody noticed I was actually gone until 3 days later, and by then, what I'd already set in motion couldn't be undone. My name is Adrian Voss, and this is the story of the family reunion that ended my marriage, and the year that followed, which honestly turned out to be the most important year of my entire life. I want to give you some background first, because you need to understand the 12 years leading up to that reunion to really understand why I did what I did. I married my wife, Marissa, when I was 28. She came from a big, close-knit family, 5 siblings, a mother named Carol who ran that family like a small government, and a father, Gordon, who'd built a modestly successful chain of hardware stores across the state and never let anyone forget it. I came from a much smaller family, just me and my mother, my father having passed away when I was 17, so honestly, when I first married into Marissa's family, I was almost grateful for the noise and chaos of it all. It felt, for a while, like gaining something I'd lost a long time ago. But over the years, I slowly learned that being welcomed into a big family and being respected within a big family are two very different things. Marissa's family had this dynamic where certain members were simply above criticism, her older brother Trent especially, a man who'd been given nearly $1 million over the years in loans from Gordon that were never actually expected to be paid back, while the rest of the family quietly resented it but never said a word out loud. I learned early on that questioning anything Trent did, even gently, even in the most reasonable way possible, was treated like a personal attack on the entire family's honor. For 12 years, I mostly kept my head down at family events. I told myself it wasn't my place to stir things up, that Marissa's family dynamics were hers to navigate, not mine to fix. But something had been building in me for a long time, this slow, quiet frustration at constantly being treated like an outsider who happened to share a last name, even after over a decade of showing up to every birthday, every holiday, every single family reunion without fail. The reunion where everything finally broke happened last summer, at a big rented lake house Gordon had booked for the extended family, nearly 30 people over one long weekend. Things were fine for the first day, the usual mix of barbecues and lake swimming and Carol quietly directing everyone like a stage manager. The trouble started on the second evening, during dinner, when Trent, half joking, half serious in that particular way he always was, made a comment about how my modest career as a high school history teacher must make things tight financially for Marissa, followed by a suggestion that maybe I should think about getting a real job one of these days. I want to be honest, I'd heard variations of this joke for years and usually let it slide, because pushing back never seemed worth the fallout. But something about that particular night, maybe exhaustion, maybe just finally reaching some invisible limit, made me respond differently this time. I calmly pointed out that being a teacher was, in fact, a real job, and that unlike some people at the table, I had actually paid back every loan I'd ever taken out in my life. The table went quiet for a second, and then Carol, Marissa's mother, jumped in immediately, not to smooth things over, but to defend Trent, saying I had no right to bring up old family matters at a happy occasion. From there, it spiraled fast. Gordon chimed in, said I'd always had a chip on my shoulder about the family's success. Marissa's sister accused me of always making things about money. And through all of it, Marissa sat right next to me and said absolutely nothing in my defense, not one word, just stared down at her plate while her entire family took turns dismantling me at the dinner table. Afterward, once we were alone in the guest room upstairs, I tried explaining to Marissa how humiliating that whole exchange had felt, 12 years of quietly absorbing little digs finally boiling over in one uncomfortable dinner. Instead of understanding, instead of even acknowledging what I'd just gone through in front of her entire family, Marissa told me I needed to apologize to everyone the next morning at breakfast, that I'd ruined the mood of the reunion, that this was exactly the kind of behavior that made her family uncomfortable around me. And then she said the sentence that changed everything. She stood there, arms crossed, and said, "You have two options, Adrian, apologize, or leave." Like I was a misbehaving guest at someone else's house, not her husband of 12 years standing in the exact same marriage she was. If you've ever had a moment where someone you love suddenly makes you feel like an outsider in your own life, I think you already understand exactly what that felt like standing in that room. And if this story is already pulling you in, go ahead and subscribe now, because what I did next, and what happened over the following year, is honestly not something I could have planned, even if I'd tried. I didn't argue with her. I didn't yell, didn't demand she take my side, didn't even really try to convince her she was wrong. Something in me just went very calm and very clear all at once. I told her, quietly, okay, picked up my phone, walked downstairs, and out to the driveway, where I stood alone under that big lake house porch light and bought a one-way plane ticket, first flight out the next morning, to a small coastal city 3 states away where an old college friend, Dennis, had been quietly telling me for years that his growing marine equipment repair business could always use an extra set of hands if I ever wanted a change of pace. I want to explain something here, because I know this decision probably sounds impulsive from the outside, but it honestly wasn't as sudden as it looked. That option with Dennis had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind for almost 2 years, a kind of escape hatch I never seriously considered using, because leaving meant uprooting an entire life, a marriage, everything familiar. But standing in that driveway, phone in hand, 12 years of quiet resentment finally reaching some kind of breaking point, it stopped feeling like an impulsive decision and started feeling like the only decision that actually made sense anymore. I flew out at 6 the next morning, before anyone else in that lake house was even awake. I left a short note for Marissa, not cruel, not dramatic, just honest, telling her I loved her, but that I couldn't keep shrinking myself smaller and smaller just to remain comfortable furniture in her family's world. I told her I needed space to figure out what I actually wanted from my own life, separate from 12 years of trying to earn approval from people who'd apparently never planned on giving it. Here's the part that genuinely surprised even me. Nobody in that entire family noticed I was gone until almost 3 days later. Marissa, apparently, assumed I'd simply taken an early morning walk to cool off, then assumed I was avoiding everyone out of embarrassment, and it wasn't until the 3rd day, when she finally went looking for me at the small local motel she assumed I'd retreated to, that she discovered I wasn't anywhere nearby at all, that I was, in fact, on the other side of the country. I want to pause here and talk honestly about what those first few months apart actually felt like, because I don't want to make this sound easier than it was. It was hard. Genuinely hard. I missed Marissa in ways I hadn't expected, missed the version of her from earlier in our marriage, before every family gathering slowly chipped away at whatever confidence I once had. But I also started to notice something else, something that surprised me. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't constantly bracing myself for the next subtle dig, the next dinner table joke at my expense that everyone else would laugh along with while I sat there absorbing it. Working alongside Dennis at his marine equipment business turned into something I genuinely hadn't expected. Within a few months, what started as simply helping out grew into a real partnership, since Dennis had been looking for someone reliable to help him formally expand the business into a second location along the coast, someone who understood logistics and scheduling skills. It turned out that over a decade of managing a busy classroom had actually prepared me for surprisingly well. By the end of that first year, I wasn't just helping out anymore, I was a full working partner in a business that was growing fast enough to genuinely support both of our families comfortably. Marissa and I talked periodically over those months, careful, complicated conversations, feeling out where things actually stood between us. About 4 months in, she flew out to see me, and for the first time in a long time, we had an honest conversation, not at some crowded family dinner table, just the two of us, away from Carol, away from Gordon, away from Trent's jokes and her entire family's unspoken hierarchy of whose feelings mattered and whose didn't. She admitted something to me during that visit that genuinely surprised me. She said that standing in that guest room, telling me to apologize or leave, some part of her had actually expected me to simply apologize, like I always had before, because in 12 years, I'd never once actually chosen the second option. She said watching me actually leave, actually follow through, terrified her in a way she hadn't expected, not because she thought I couldn't survive without her family's approval, but because some part of her realized, maybe for the first time, that she had married someone who genuinely respected himself enough to eventually stop absorbing that kind of treatment indefinitely. If you've stuck with me this far, thank you, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time, because what happened between Marissa and me after that visit, and how things finally settled with her family, might honestly surprise you. We didn't get back together right away, and honestly, I think that space mattered more than either of us initially realized. Over the following months, Marissa slowly started setting boundaries with her own family that she'd never set before, boundaries I'd honestly stopped expecting to ever see. She stopped attending every single family event automatically, started pushing back, gently but firmly, whenever Carol or Trent made comments that crossed a line, the exact same kind of comments I'd absorbed silently for over a decade. About 8 months after that reunion, Marissa made the decision to move out to the coast permanently, not because I demanded it, but because, in her own words, she'd finally realized that the version of herself who existed inside her family's orbit wasn't actually the version of herself she wanted to keep being for the rest of her life. We didn't rush back into exactly what our marriage used to look like. Instead, we slowly built something new, something that felt more equal, more honest, with far fewer unspoken rules about whose feelings were allowed to matter at the dinner table. As for her family, things remained complicated, honestly, the way these things usually do. Gordon and Carol were furious for a long time, blamed me entirely for breaking up their family gathering and, eventually, for taking their daughter across the country. Trent, predictably, never once acknowledged his own comment that started the whole thing. But Marissa, for the first time in the 12 years I'd known her, stopped trying to smooth everything over on their behalf, stopped apologizing for boundaries that were, frankly, long overdue. I think about that lake house driveway sometimes, standing there under that porch light, phone in hand, genuinely uncertain whether I was making the biggest mistake of my life or finally making the first truly honest decision I'd made in years. Looking back now, from where I'm standing today, running a business I'm genuinely proud of, married to a woman who finally chooses me openly instead of quietly managing her family's comfort at my expense, I think I got my answer. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Sometimes the people who love you the most will still, without even fully realizing it, ask you to keep shrinking yourself down just to keep their world comfortable, and sometimes the healthiest thing you can possibly do, for yourself and honestly for the relationship too, is finally choose the option nobody expected you to actually take. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories exactly like this one coming every week, honest, real, and sometimes surprising in ways you don't expect. Thank you for listening to mine.